What would you do if the HOA decided your garage didn't belong to you anymore? If one day, without warning, they showed up with a clipboard and a smirk, telling you that your own property was now theirs to control? Jake Bennett didn't have to imagine it, he was living it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns of Willow Creek Estates, a suburban neighborhood that prided itself on pristine uniformity. But today, something was off. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered at the end of Jake's driveway, their whispers cutting through the crisp autumn air like knives. At the center of it all stood Rick Coleman, the self-important head of the HOA, his pressed navy polo neatly tucked into beige slacks, a clipboard clutched in his hands like a weapon. Jake had barely stepped out of his garage when Rick cleared his throat, his voice dripping with authority. "Mr. Bennett, I'm afraid we have a serious issue to discuss." Jake's grip on his wrench tightened. He had been working under the hood of his car, minding his own business, when the sound of murmuring voices outside made him step out. He hadn't expected to find a full-blown tribunal waiting for him. "Whatever it is, I don't have time for it," Jake shot back, wiping the grease off his hands. Rick's smirk deepened. "Well, you'll want to make time. Your garage is in direct violation of multiple HOA regulations." He tapped his clipboard for effect, as if the mere presence of paperwork made his words law. Jake felt his jaw tighten. Violation? Of what? Rick sighed, his condescending tone making Jake's blood boil. Unapproved modifications, non-compliant use of space, and let's not forget the numerous noise complaints regarding your vehicle. We've tried to resolve this amicably, but you've failed to comply. As a result, the HOA board has voted to seize control of this garage space until further notice. Jake's mind reeled. Seize control? His garage? His home? It was so absurd, so unbelievable, that for a moment, he actually thought Rick was joking. But the smug look on his face, the knowing glances between the gathered neighbors, told him otherwise. He stepped forward, his pulse pounding. "You're out of your damn mind if you think I'm handing over my garage. I built this space. I paid for it. You have no right." Rick held up a hand, cutting him off. "Oh, but we do. You signed the HOA agreement when you moved in, Mr. Bennett. Everything we're doing is within our rights." Jake barely noticed the screen door swinging open behind him until he heard Emily's voice, laced with unease. "Jake, what's going on?" He didn't take his eyes off Rick. "They're trying to take our garage." Emily stepped beside him, arms crossed, her face pale. "This can't be legal." Rick's smirk only grew. "Oh, it's perfectly legal. Feel free to consult an attorney if you don't believe me." The arrogance in his voice sent a fresh surge of anger through Jake. He wanted to punch that smug look off Rick's face, to wipe away that air of untouchable confidence. But he knew that was exactly what Rick wanted, for him to snap, to give them a reason to paint him as the aggressor. Instead, he forced himself to take a slow, deep breath. His voice was steady when he finally spoke. "Fine. You want to play this game? I'll see you in court." For the first time, Rick's smirk faltered. It was only a flicker, a momentary crack in his carefully curated mask of authority, but Jake caught it. The crowd of neighbors began to disperse, their hushed voices carrying a mixture of intrigue and unease. As Rick turned on his heel and walked away, Jake knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, the dining table was buried under stacks of papers, printouts of HOA bylaws, and highlighted sections of the agreement they had signed when they moved into Willow Creek Estates. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting with every absurd clause he read. Emily sat beside him, flipping through documents with the same wide-eyed disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, shaking her head. "Half of these rules are so vague they can mean anything. Community aesthetic standards must be maintained? That's not a rule, it's an excuse to control whatever they want. Jake exhaled sharply. And there's nothing in here about the HOA having the authority to seize private property. They can issue fines, sure, but take my garage? No way. Emily bit her lip, her fingers tracing over a section of fine print. So if they don't have the legal power to do this, why do they sound so confident? Jake knew why. Because HOAs thrived on intimidation. They banked on homeowners being too overwhelmed or exhausted to fight back. Most people just rolled over to avoid the hassle. But Jake wasn't most people. He grabbed his phone and pulled up his email, typing out a message to Claire Hastings, a lawyer recommended by a friend who had fought, and won, a case against an overreaching HOA. By the next afternoon, he was sitting across from Claire in her office, laying out everything that had happened. She listened intently, her sharp green eyes scanning through the HOA's paperwork as she flipped through pages with methodical precision. When she finally looked up, her expression was calm but firm. "This is textbook HOA overreach," she said, setting the papers down. "They don't have the authority to seize your property without due process. They're hoping you'll just give up and comply." Jake leaned forward. "So what's our move?" Claire tapped the papers with her pen. "First, we hit them with a cease and desist letter. That forces them to either back off or take the next step, which would be filing a lawsuit against you, which I highly doubt they want to do. Second, we start gathering evidence. Anything you have, emails, letters, any interaction with them. We document everything." Jake nodded. "I've got emails. And I'll start taking pictures of my garage, just in case." Claire smiled approvingly. "Good. The more proof we have, the better." But Jake didn't even get the chance to start gathering evidence before the HOA launched their next attack. That night, just as they were putting the kids to bed, Jake's phone buzzed with an email notification. His stomach dropped as he opened it. It was from his boss. "Jake, I need you in my office first thing tomorrow morning. I just received a concerning report about your behavior in the neighborhood. We need to talk." His blood ran cold. "You've got to be kidding me." Emily frowned. "What is it?" Jake handed her the phone, his pulse pounding. "The HOA is trying to screw with my job now." Emily read the message, her face darkening. "They wouldn't." "They would," Jake said bitterly. And they did. The next morning, he walked into his boss's office, where his supervisor, Mark, sat behind his desk, looking uneasy. "Jake, I'm going to be upfront with you," Mark said, folding his hands on the desk. "I got an anonymous complaint about you. It claims you've been harassing your neighbors and causing disturbances in the community." Jake scoffed. "That's complete garbage." Mark sighed. "I figured as much. But it came with a petition, apparently signed by multiple residents in your neighborhood." Jake stiffened. "A petition?" Mark nodded and slid a folder across the desk. Jake opened it to find a neatly typed statement accusing him of aggressive and disruptive behavior in the community. Below it were a list of signatures, names he recognized. Neighbors who had once smiled and waved at him. People he had helped shovel snow for in the winter. His hands curled into fists. "This is a setup." "I believe you," Mark said carefully. "But corporate won't like this kind of attention. I can't ignore it. Just, lay low for a while, okay?" Jake left the office seething. This wasn't just about his garage anymore. The HOA wasn't just trying to intimidate him, they were trying to destroy him. When he got home, he found Emily waiting for him at the door, pale and holding a stack of glossy flyers. "Jake," she said, her voice shaking, "you need to see this." He grabbed one and read the bold, capitalized headline. "Protect our community standards. Stop neighborhood violations." Below was a paragraph detailing how a certain homeowner had been repeatedly warned about breaking HOA rules and had refused to comply, causing tension and unrest. There was no name, but the message was clear. They were talking about him. Rage bubbled in Jake's chest. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a war. And if the HOA wanted a war, he was more than ready to give them one. The next morning, Jake awoke to a strange silence. Usually, the hum of morning routines, lawnmowers, cars warming up, neighbors chatting, filled the air. But today, something felt off. When he stepped outside, his stomach twisted into a knot. His garage door was padlocked shut. A bright red notice was taped over the handle, stamped with the HOA's official seal. Notice of seizure. This property is under investigation for ongoing violations. Access restricted until further notice. Jake's hands clenched into fists. This was it. They were taking his garage by force. He stormed back inside, grabbing his phone. Rick Coleman's smug voice answered on the first ring. "Ah, Mr. Bennett," Rick said, his tone almost gleeful. "I see you've noticed our enforcement action. You've got 5 seconds to explain before I tear that notice off and take a crowbar to your lock," Jake growled. Rick chuckled. "I wouldn't recommend that. You see, if you attempt to remove official HOA property, we'll be forced to escalate this matter legally. And trust me, you do not want that." Jake paced the kitchen, his blood boiling. "You can't just lock me out of my own property." "Oh, but we can," Rick said smoothly. "Per the bylaws, we have the right to secure non-compliant areas of the community until corrective actions are taken." Jake gritted his teeth. "There are no violations in my garage." Rick sighed dramatically. "Then you shouldn't have a problem with a thorough HOA inspection to confirm that, should you? Of course, in the meantime, the space will remain inaccessible. Community safety concerns, you understand." Jake hung up before he could say something that would get him arrested. By the time Emily woke up and saw the garage situation, she was equal parts furious and terrified. "They can't do this," she whispered, gripping Jake's arm. "They just did." That afternoon, Claire came over, her face dark with anger. After taking pictures of the notice and the padlock, she turned to Jake. "This is beyond unlawful. They have no legal grounds to restrict access to your own property." "I tried the cops," Jake said bitterly. "They called it a civil dispute." Claire shook her head. "Then we're taking this straight to court. But first, I need you to document everything, any past interactions with the HOA, security footage, emails. If they're willing to go this far, we need to assume they'll try worse." Jake nodded, feeling a rare flicker of hope, until that night, when things got even worse. At 2 a.m., a loud scraping sound outside jolted him awake. He sat up, heart pounding, and rushed to the window. Under the dim glow of the street lamp, he saw a shadowy figure standing near his garage, clipboard in hand. It was Leo Monroe, one of the HOA board members. Jake narrowed his eyes as Leo crouched near the base of the garage door, scribbling notes. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed his phone, turned on his camera, and marched outside. "Leo," he barked. Leo flinched but quickly regained his composure, standing with an arrogant smirk. "Just conducting a routine HOA inspection, Mr. Bennett." Jake stepped closer. "At 2 in the morning?" "Well," Leo said, slipping the clipboard under his arm, "someone has to ensure compliance. We've had concerns about unauthorized activity in this space." Jake fought the urge to punch him. "You mean in my own garage, which you've illegally locked up?" Leo shrugged. "It's not personal, Jake. We just want what's best for the community." "Get off my property before I call the police," Jake warned. Leo's smirk widened. "By all means." But you might want to think about what else we could uncover." His voice carried a smug warning, and then, just like that, he turned and walked away. Jake stood there, seething, watching as Leo disappeared into the night. The next day, things took an even darker turn. As Jake was heading out to work, a police car pulled into his driveway. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Bennett," one of them said, "we've received a report of unpermitted construction on your property. We need to conduct an inspection." Jake blinked. "Excuse me?" The officer sighed. "We got a formal complaint stating you've been making unauthorized modifications to your garage, potentially violating local zoning laws. We need to check it out." Jake's hands balled into fists. "Another HOA stunt." "Go ahead," he said through gritted teeth, stepping aside. The officers did a full walkthrough of the garage, inspecting every inch. When they finished, one of them sighed and shook his head. "There's nothing here," he said. "Everything is up to code." Jake exhaled sharply. "So what happens now?" The officer hesitated. "Well, officially, nothing. But I document everything. If they file more complaints, you'll want a paper trail." As the cops pulled away, Jake spotted Leo Monroe watching from across the street, hands in his pockets, looking smug. Jake stared him down. Leo smirked, and then, ever so slowly, gave him a mocking wave. That was it. Jake turned, stormed into the house, and dialed Claire. "They just sent the cops after me," he said, barely containing his fury. There was a long pause before Claire spoke, her voice calm but ice-cold. "Then it's time we stop playing defense." The courtroom was colder than Jake expected, not just in temperature but in atmosphere. A thick tension hung in the air as he sat at the plaintiff's table beside Claire, his jaw tight, his fists clenched beneath the polished wood. Across from them, the HOA's legal team was seated, led by a stiff, gray-suited attorney who looked as smug as Rick Coleman had the day he tried to seize Jake's garage. Rick himself sat just behind the defense table, his expression unreadable, though Jake could feel the satisfaction radiating off him. He thought this was going to be an easy win. He had no idea what was coming. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-50s, took her seat and wasted no time. "Let's begin," she said, flipping open a case file. "The HOA has brought forward allegations that Mr. Bennett has repeatedly violated community bylaws, necessitating the enforcement actions they've taken. Mr. Bennett has countered with claims of harassment, trespassing, and illegal seizure of private property. We will hear arguments from both sides." The HOA's attorney rose first, walking toward the bench with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who thought they had already won. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a clear-cut case of a homeowner refusing to comply with regulations that he agreed to upon moving into our community. The HOA has acted entirely within its rights in attempting to resolve this matter, yet Mr. Bennett has chosen to escalate the situation rather than cooperate." Jake's teeth clenched, but Claire placed a steadying hand on his arm, her calm presence a silent reassurance. The attorney continued, pulling out a stack of printed documents. "We have compiled numerous complaints from community members regarding excessive noise from Mr. Bennett's garage, unapproved modifications that disrupt neighborhood uniformity, and, most concerningly, instances of aggressive behavior toward HOA officials." The board had no choice but to take action. With a satisfied nod, he returned to his seat. Claire stood next, adjusting her blazer before stepping forward. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "we intend to prove that the HOA's actions were not only excessive but also unlawful. What Mr. Bennett has experienced is not a simple bylaw dispute but a targeted campaign of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power." She picked up the stack of complaints the HOA's attorney had just referenced and flipped through them with a small, unimpressed smirk. "The defense has submitted numerous complaints, yes, but let's take a closer look." She held up the top page. No names, no addresses, no timestamps. Just vague claims of noise disturbances and unauthorized modifications. I could write half of these myself in 5 minutes. What evidence do they actually have? The judge leaned forward slightly. Does the defense have any recordings, decibel measurements, security footage, anything to corroborate these complaints? The HOA's attorney shifted in his seat. The board takes complaints very seriously, Your Honor. Then surely you would have required evidence before acting, wouldn't you? Claire cut in. If you were about to seize a man's property, surely you'd want proof that he was actually breaking the rules? Silence. Claire turned to the judge. The truth is, Your Honor, these complaints were fabricated to justify an abuse of power. But let's move beyond the noise issue and get to the heart of the matter: trespassing, intimidation, and unlawful property seizure. She gestured to Rachel, who was sitting behind Jake, phone in hand. My client's wife recorded an incident in which the HOA's representatives attempted to enter their property and seize their garage without a warrant, a court order, or even so much as a proper legal notice. If it pleases the court, I'd like to play that footage now. The judge nodded, and Rachel stepped forward, setting her phone on the table as the video played. The courtroom was silent as the footage rolled, Rick Coleman and his enforcers standing in Jake's driveway, ordering him to vacate, and when he refused, attempting to push past him. This is perfectly within our rights, Rick's voice sneered from the recording. Legal rights? Jake's recorded voice snapped. You're trespassing on my property. You have no authority here. And if you so much as touch anything in that garage, I'll have you arrested for theft. On the video, Rick's smirk faltered before he turned and stormed off, barking orders at his men to leave. Claire paused the video. Your Honor, not only did the HOA attempt an illegal seizure, but when intimidation failed, they escalated. They sent board members to loiter outside my client's home in the middle of the night. They filed false complaints with law enforcement, resulting in an unnecessary police investigation. And, as our next piece of evidence will show, they even launched a smear campaign in an attempt to destroy Mr. Bennett's reputation. She reached into a folder and pulled out one of the flyers that had been circulated through the neighborhood, the one claiming a disruptive homeowner was causing unrest. She handed it to the judge. The judge's brow furrowed as she read it. Then she turned to the defense. Mr. Coleman, care to explain this? Rick, for the first time since the trial had begun, looked uncomfortable. It was meant to be a community update. A community update, the judge repeated flatly. Targeting a single homeowner? Rick's face reddened, but the HOA's attorney quickly interjected. Your Honor, the board was simply trying to maintain order within the neighborhood. Claire smiled. It was a smile of someone who had just caught her opponent in a corner. Let's talk about maintaining order. Because we also have evidence that, while they were harassing my client, certain HOA board members were engaged in activities that are far more concerning. She placed a thick manila folder on the table. Financial records. The room fell into stunned silence. The HOA's attorney stiffened. Even Rick looked genuinely alarmed. My team obtained these records during discovery, Claire said smoothly. And what do they show? Oh, just that members of the HOA board, including Mr. Coleman himself, have been misusing HOA funds for personal expenses, including unauthorized reimbursements, personal travel, and, would you look at that, legal fees paid in advance for cases just like this one. Cases where they expected to steamroll a homeowner and walk away untouched. Rick visibly paled. The judge exhaled slowly, setting the file aside. She looked at the HOA's attorney with an expression that made it clear she was running out of patience. Anything you'd like to add before I make my ruling? The lawyer hesitated. Then, in a tone far less confident than before, he muttered, No, Your Honor. The judge folded her hands. Then let me be clear. Not only has the HOA failed to prove its case against Mr. Bennett, but it has engaged in harassment, intimidation, and unethical financial conduct. Effective immediately, the injunction against Mr. Bennett is granted. The HOA is to remove all fines, restrictions, and claims against his property. Furthermore, I am awarding Mr. Bennett restitution for legal fees. She fixed Rick with a cold stare. And I strongly suggest the HOA conduct an internal review, because if I see evidence of this kind of behavior again, it will not end with fines. She slammed the gavel down. Case dismissed. Jake barely heard the applause that erupted from the gallery. He turned to Claire, stunned. "We won," Rachel whispered beside him. "We didn't just win," Claire said, smirking at the panicked faces of the HOA board. "We just buried them." The ruling spread through Willow Creek Estates like wildfire. Neighbors who had once turned their backs on Jake now hesitated, their hushed whispers shifting from judgment to curiosity, and in some cases, quiet admiration. The mighty HOA, which had ruled with an iron fist for years, was now crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. Within a week, Rick Coleman resigned, citing personal reasons. Leo Monroe, the smug board member who had lurked outside Jake's home in the dead of night, vanished from the community without a word. Soon after, an emergency HOA board meeting was called, and a wave of resignations followed as the remaining members scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. For the first time in years, homeowners felt emboldened to speak up. Stories emerged: residents who had been forced to repaint their homes over imaginary violations, families who had been fined into submission, elderly neighbors who had been threatened over minor landscaping choices. Jake's case had done more than just clear his name, it had exposed a pattern of corruption and control that had been allowed to fester for far too long. And now, people were ready to fight back. A new board was elected, one that promised fairness, transparency, and an end to the intimidation tactics that had ruled the neighborhood. Jake watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. It didn't erase the stress, the late nights, or the damage that had been done to his reputation, but it proved something important: HOAs didn't hold as much power as they wanted people to believe. When challenged, they could be beaten. One evening, as he stood in his garage, the space finally his again, Jake let out a long breath. The battle had been exhausting, but the victory was worth it. He reached for his toolbox, his fingers brushing against the worn metal. He had fought not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been bullied, manipulated, or silenced by people who thought rules were weapons instead of guidelines. As the engine of his car rumbled to life, a slow smile crossed his face. He had won. And he wouldn't be the last homeowner to take a stand. What about you? Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA or a Karen with too much authority? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.